I'm in Lamu, and what I'm about to read are events that happened 8 years ago, but are in my book called When It's Dark Enough, You Can See the Stars. Stepping out of Jomo Kenyatta Terminal, the contrast between Europe and Africa bore down. The sidewalk was hot, muggy, and crowded, even though it was the middle of the night. Amid a jumble of unexpected sensations, smells, and sounds, the pale orange glow from the terminal lights showed the sweat stains under people's arms. I listened to language around me morph from English into Swahili and Patios, their sound rhythms softer than English. Groups of anxious tourists searched for their hotel vans. Experienced travelers walked with purpose to meet their taximan or their families. The pilots and stewardesses from my British Airways flight walked by in a group, their uniforms an aftertaste of European order. Above them, large insects bruised themselves against the lights. I looked for Robert. He had driven taxi for us many times. When he spoke behind me, I jumped. "Oh, hello, Robert." "Robert." For a long time, he could only shake my hand with both of his and shake his head. "Hello, sir. I'm so sorry, so sorry. His ways are not known to us. They're with God now. They were good women. He is loving them. Let me help with that." "Thank you. Is there no one else?" "No, just myself." "On your own? That's not right. You should not go through this on your own." I thought of Jude with his father. I thought of Rose. Would they come? The crowd of drivers in the parking lot waiting for flights to arrive talked in small knots, smoked and laughed and argued. None of them had any idea what had happened to me. They were indifferent, like the people in the Bruegel painting I'd studied on the plane. I felt appalled they could live in their lives unaware of what had happened in mine. I sat up front with Robert, and we talked about Bess and Claire and how much fun Robert had driving them only a few short weeks ago. Then we fell quiet. The taxi windows were rolled down, and we drove through traffic toward the Aero Club in Karen, past ailing minivans, bumper-to-bumper cars, and overloaded trucks. Large white ibis shrieked from the trees, flying up from a branch only to awkwardly resettle on another. They seemed out of place, but I was the one out of place. The birds didn't care. I thought how slender a thread binds us to this life. Every few minutes, Robert shook his head. "God is looking after them. God will look after you too, but you have to take care of yourself." As a carefully placed afterthought, he added, "You'll come back to Kenya, yes?" I had called Claire's closest girlfriend. As much as she wanted to join me, Africa was too far from Canada and too short notice. I reaffirmed my decision made on the plane, not to shy away, but to move as close as I could to every aspect of what lay ahead. I would say yes. Claire would have. She would have looked intensely at my body and created ceremony and ritual around my death. I promised myself not to be a Puritan. "Robert, do you remember the time Claire spotted the boy selling a pair of small yellow birds?" "Oh, yes, I do. They love birds." "I know, and Claire was upset to see those beautiful birds in a cage. The boy couldn't believe we were buying his birds, and seeing us walk up, he doubled the price. We wanted to set the birds free, remember?" "Yes, I do. When you dropped us at Di and Tim's, we went in their garden and said a prayer for all wild things kept in cages. Claire opened a little wooden door, but the birds didn't realize they were free. They stayed in the cage." "I never heard," he said. "Yes, finally they flew off in the evening light, two small yellow birds into all that green world." "Do you believe in God, sir?" "Oh, I'm having a hard time, Robert." "Well, I do. The story you tell me is like us. We live in a cage here on earth. When we die, the cage opens and our soul flies back to God. That's what I believe. That's what happened for Claire and Bess. They back with God now. Thank you for saying that, Robert. It was midnight when we arrived at the Aero Club. Representatives from the UK High Commission, the US Embassy, and the head of the search were waiting. I saw their serious faces as I passed under an old wooden propeller above the door into the bar. The head of the search outlined the situation. Yesterday, the plane was found higher up the mountain than the main search had been able to look the day before. Tomorrow, he said, tomorrow we will bring the bodies back to Nairobi. The next morning, the woman at the Aero Club desk handed me a note. A woman named Casilda wanted me to call her. The note said she'd met Claire and Bess just last week. When I called, she told me how they had talked about donkeys, the spaying of feral cats in Lamu. 4 days ago, Bess and Claire were alive. She invited me to stay at her home, and they had a small guest cottage. She picked me up before lunch, and the tumult of the road ended when we entered their driveway. She felt Claire was a kindred spirit and told me how they discussed life over coffee sitting on the deck at Poponi Hotel, except Claire sipped coconut water. Casilda offered to be my guide. She said she had the time. I sensed she really didn't have the time, but I accepted. To sit alone on a bench in their garden, to listen to the unfamiliar sounds of an African night, to stamp my feet on the ground, helped me remember I was alive. I would drift asleep to snap awake. My mind lost traction at night, but continued grinding. Even if I slept, I felt tired in the morning. The unfamiliar objects in the cottage, a huge ostrich egg, a military uniform in a case, a sword, several pieces of Maasai beadwork, and a zebra rug reminded me how far away from home I was. The funeral parlor wouldn't see me until the following afternoon. In the morning, Robert drove me to the new U.S. Embassy. After the 1998 terrorist attack, the embassy had moved and imposed more security. My name was at the gate, and I didn't have to wait. In the heart of the building, I met the acting head of the embassy. We exchanged phone numbers, and she said she would let me know when Claire and Bess's things arrived. This was her first week on the job. This was the first thing she had to deal with. Casilda parked in the funeral home's narrow driveway. The director sat behind his desk and kept up a patter of small talk while we sat on the low couch opposite. Looking up at his young face, his black hair and glasses, he was saying how he liked his job, and he hadn't thought he'd become a funeral director, but had fallen into it. He wore a coat and a tie. He said I would have to identify the bodies and interrupted his conversation when the phone rang. He talked briefly into the receiver, then hung up the old-style black phone on its cradle. He turned back to us to say, "Where were we?" An assistant in a white coat knocked. They were ready. I sank deeper into the couch. I could no more imagine seeing Claire than I could accept that they had died. "You don't have to do this," the director said, "and if you'd rather, I can confirm their identity. We have their passports." "Thank you. Casilda, would you come with me as a witness?" They acted as if this were a social visit with tea served soon. But in return, the director said the coroner would come later that afternoon to conduct an autopsy. My body tensed and I said, "We know how they died. We know." "Yes, would he cut them?" "He would." "No, he won't. They've been through enough." They died in a national park. It's a requirement. But let me talk to him, perhaps. He picked up his black phone, dialed, and then listened to it ring. Mr. N, please. Thank you." "Hello, Mr. N. Yes, I'm fine. They're fine. How is your family?" "Oh, that's good. Please give her my best." "I have a question. Would you be able to conduct the autopsies on the 2 women this afternoon without invasion? The family isn't in favor." A long minute passed. He smiled across the desk while he listened. Yes, I see. All right then. That's good. I'll tell them. Thank you. Bye. He placed the phone back in its cradle. Strange to see someone use an old-fashioned phone. He says he can do the autopsy without cutting them. Thank you, thank you. Would you like to see them to say goodbye? I expected a long walk, but they were only 5 steps outside his office. Small knots of families were talking in the hall. As I walked out the director's office, they fell silent and exchanged glances with each other. I stood in front of the door, dreading to go in. Take your time. I walked into the small room. There were a few chairs against the wood-paneled walls. A small altar with unlit candles stood on the opposite side of the room. In front of me were 2 heavy gold and black brocade cloths, similar to bedspreads, draped over the crude shapes of their bodies. How do I do this? Claire wouldn't like the bedspread. I saw 2 sets of black rubber wheels supporting the stainless steel legs of the transfer tables. I collapsed into a chair. My breathing came in shallow breaths, making me lightheaded. I could look at the tables, but then had to look away. I felt along Claire's body, cool from the mortuary chamber. Her feet were bare. At the beginning of any flight, she liked to kick off her shoes. I pulled a chair close to the table, resting my weight on my arm, and let the steel edge of the tabletop press into my skin. I pressed until it hurt. Then I stood up and gently folded back the bedspread. Her hair was combed out in a long wave above her head. Its color was tawnier than I remembered. Her lips lightly touched and her eyes were closed. Her face held the curve of a smile that contradicted death. She had a few cuts and one darker scar near her right temple, stitched closed. She wouldn't like the scar. I leaned in to kiss her. Her lips felt cold. As though feeling her temperature, I placed my palm across her forehead. I left my hand there and felt her coolness begin to suck warmth from my hand. I closed my eyes and touched along her torso, her legs, her feet, each toe. I silently said to her, Claire, you are seen. You are loved. I remember Robert's conversation in the taxi about the small yellow birds. You're free now. You're free, I said out loud. I uncovered Bess's face. I kissed her forehead and said goodbye. They wore their own dresses. Bess had on her golden goose cowboy boots, and she didn't look peaceful. Her blonde hair was parted over her right eye. Her look said, this is not right. She had not had time to find her true love. She had not had her children, and I alternated between hyperventilating and looking. Uncharacteristically, they wore no jewelry. I moved around the room and sat in one or another of the chairs. I heard people walking by in the hall. Once someone banged into the door, and I jumped. I wanted to light the candles, but couldn't find any matches. I whispered Rumi's poem to Claire, one that I had shared with her early in our relationship. When I heard my first love song, I ran out to find you, not knowing how blind that was. For true lovers are not out there somewhere. They are in each other all the time. I placed the brocade cloth back over their heads and walked out. The director and Casilda were waiting in his office. Will you have some tea? Outside the room, I could hear 2 groups of people meet in the hallway, all hellos and laughter.